Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise, where we are talking all things true crime. If you are a returning 10 to Lifer, welcome back. I am so happy to have you here with me today, and if you're brand new and checking out the channel for the first time, welcome. I hope you appreciate today's content, the coverage, and I hope you just enjoy and you really appreciate the coverage and what it is we're trying to do here. Now, one of the most infuriating things to hear when discussing the topic of violence in relationships, it's really the comment section and all of the comments saying, well, why didn't she just leave? Why didn't she just tell her family and friends? Why didn't she just reach out for help? Which anyone who has ever been in that kind of situation or who has loved somebody who's been in that kind of situation, they know just how insane it really is to even say that to a person. It's never that easy. People get in relationships thinking that they're meant to be together forever, hoping that everything will be all happy, all good, until it's not. And it's hard to just leave when there are kids involved as well, or even for financial reasons, especially in today's rough economic times. Today's case, though, is frustrating because had one or two things changed, it could have all been different. Maybe with just a little bit more time to figure things out, just 1 or 2 months even, maybe you can get out of a bad situation. And that's the case we're talking about today, the story of Elizabeth Sullivan. So guys, let's jump right in. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I used to be so mentally checked out because of how tired I was. I would get home, all I would be focused on is getting to bed because I knew I wasn't going to get a good night of sleep, so I would end up skipping quality time with my husband, my kids, and it just made me miserable. Honestly, it really did. But now that I drink Beam Dream every night, not only am I getting amazing sleep, but it truly has changed my quality of life. 1 scoop of Beam Dream is clinically shown to help you fall asleep faster, sleep through the night, and wake up refreshed. It leaves you with 0 grogginess compared to other supplements, and get this, it costs less than a cup of coffee. So luxury and sleep doesn't have to be expensive. Now, creating a custom flavor with them was such an honor for me because I believe in the product so much. We went through a very rigorous sampling process. I helped collaborate with them on the artwork for the bag. I mean, I really poured so much of myself into this because I truly love this product. And I wanted to make sure that it was absolutely perfect for all of you guys. And as it turns out, you guys have voted and you love it too. So much so that it completely sold out and there had to be another order placed just to have more bags because you love the flavor so much. And what I love is also how versatile it is because now that it's so warm outside, I don't need to be drinking it warm. I can, but I also love pouring it over ice because it tastes just like this crisp, refreshing chocolate milk almost. It is so good. But I've already told you before, it is my sweet treat before bed and it is only 15 calories, 0 added grams of sugar. I mean, it is guilt-free but tastes so good. Now you can try it and just do a one-off, but if you subscribe, you will save 20% off every single month, plus you'll get a free frother with your order. You also can pause or cancel at any time. I mean, it is a super sweet deal. And now to celebrate the success of my partnership with Beam, you can make a purchase using my link below or my discount code 10 to life and get up to 40% off. Honestly, you guys are gonna love it. So many of you already voted that you have, and I can't wait for all of you to be getting great sleep like I am now. Elizabeth Sullivan was a 32-year-old mom of 2 living in San Diego, California. She was a very pretty, petite woman. She was only 5'3", barely 130 pounds. She had short brown hair. And if you spotted Elizabeth out, you could almost guarantee that she was going to for sure be rocking her signature red lipstick. Now, Elizabeth was born in Hampton, Virginia, which is actually where she spent her whole childhood, and she was raised there. She spent her teenage years there too, and she graduated high school from there in 2001. I couldn't find much information on what she was doing after high school. I mean, as far as if she was going to college or if she was just working full-time right out of school. And unfortunately, there wasn't really a whole lot of conversation surrounding what Elizabeth was like as a person to those who knew her best, which we usually have some information like that in cases we cover, but it was proving to be a little bit more difficult with Elizabeth. Now, growing up in Hampton, you're looking at only about a 20-minute or so drive to the military base in Norfolk, which is actually the world's largest Navy base out there. Now, being so close, it wasn't too uncommon to meet military men who were stationed there from all over the country, and this was no different for Elizabeth. In 2010, she met a man named Matthew Sullivan, or Matt as he went by. Now, Matt was in the military and he was stationed at that base in Norfolk, which is how they met. And Elizabeth was very outgoing, very witty, which was just the complete polar opposite from Matt. He was shy, he liked to keep to himself. It's kind of like the yin to each other's yang, which that's really why they were so drawn to each other, and it's why they worked out so perfectly. Their relationship took off pretty quickly. I mean, there was no 5-year-long dating process, nothing like that. They pretty much dove right into it, head first. Things moved fast. Not long after they met, Matt was reassigned to a base in San Diego, and he knew that he was going to have to move there in the upcoming months. But he didn't want to leave Elizabeth. He didn't want to leave her behind. He didn't want to leave their relationship. So he ended up proposing to her. And it was an easy yes. She was so excited. She was over the moon. The two of them got married in 2010, and they began planning their quick move to San Diego. They were super excited to start this new journey together as husband and wife. Though it didn't stay just the two of them for very long, because right in the middle of all of the chaos of packing and planning their move, Elizabeth found out that she was pregnant. Now, Elizabeth's best friend, Calandra, said that when she found out, she immediately called her and literally said, like, holy shit, there's a kid in here. I'm pregnant. Just completely surprised. It was a huge surprise. It was totally unexpected. But it kind of also just fit their relationship. I mean, everything had moved so fast. They were basically two lovebirds, head over heels for each other. So why not add a kid into the mix, right? Literally all within the same year, they met each other, got engaged, got married, found out Elizabeth was pregnant with their first child, and on top of that, moved across the country. That's a lot for anybody to handle, right? Sounds overwhelming. But Elizabeth, she handled it with complete and total grace. After moving from Virginia to California, the distance between her and her family was something that she really started to struggle with, though. And it took her a little while to get adjusted into this new life, especially as a new mom. Her family values were something that were always very important to her. She and her family were all extremely close, and they had all lived pretty close by her entire life. So to go from constantly being surrounded by family to now not seeing people for months at a time, it can become pretty lonely, even if it's just sometimes part of life. Now, out of everyone in her family, she was by far the closest with her dad. Even though they were both adults living two completely different and busy lives, Elizabeth always made time every single day to call her dad. She would love talking to him, catching up with him, and I'm sure that that really meant a lot to him and was something that he always looked forward to. That didn't just go for her dad, though. Elizabeth was pretty much always the one in the family who made sure to check in on her cousins, her aunts, her uncles, I mean, you name it. She was never somebody to go too long without talking to everyone in her family, even from miles and miles away. So during the time when this whole thing was going down back in 2014, Elizabeth was living in a 3-story townhouse with Matt and their now 2 young daughters, Ryan and Greer. They were only 2 and 4 years old at the time. Now, something that we do know about Elizabeth is she loved being a mother. Her daughters were her entire world. Her friends and her family said that she was so involved, she was just such an amazing mother, always being there for them, doing everything. Now, not that having kids replaced her family members who were back in Virginia by any means, but I kind of think that it healed her in a way, focusing on growing and raising her own family.
Ryan, what do you have there? Is that a book? Ryan, say hi.
Since Matt was in the Navy and had been deployed on multiple occasions throughout their relationship, there were often periods of time when it was just Elizabeth and the girls at the house alone. And Elizabeth made sure that everything in the house ran smoothly and was always taken care of. So all in all, Matt and Elizabeth just seemed like your average military family. That is until a call came in to 911 on October 14th, 2014. And this call started unraveling every preconceived notion about the Sullivan family. The person on the other end of the line told the operator that they wanted to file a missing persons report on their best friend. They were very concerned about her. And that missing person was Elizabeth. It seemed like from the moment Elizabeth was reported as missing, the investigators took her case very seriously. They quickly discovered that Elizabeth was last seen the day before she was reported missing on October 13th. That was also the last time that she had made any contact with anybody on her phone. The last known contact was a text message, and it was right before her phone just seemingly either died or was shut off. So almost immediately, the investigators did a deep dive into Elizabeth's personal life. And to put it bluntly, I mean, her marriage with Matt, it seemed like a huge walking red flag. Even though the marriage itself was still pretty fresh, not even a full 5 years into it yet, the couple was far from still being in the honeymoon stage. Apparently, there were tons, and I mean tons, of problems with the marriage, and it seemed like it was crumbling more and more with each passing day. At first, it was something that they kept pretty private, but after long, it became something that was really more difficult to hide. 2 years after they got married in 2012, things started to go from just your typical couple bickering back and forth to a real problem. Elizabeth's friends and family noticed a dramatic change in the way that she acted. She never seemed happy anymore to them, almost like the light was kind of just like being snuffed out of her. And on top of all of that, Elizabeth found out that she was pregnant with their second child at the time. Now, although there was nothing in my research to indicate an official diagnosis, it seems pretty clear that Elizabeth was going through some mental health struggles at the time. Imagine being super close to your family and being used to seeing them every single day, going from that to then rarely ever seeing them, on top of being a new mom, not having a good home life. That would be hard even for the strongest of people. So it could have been from her failing marriage or maybe a bit of the postpartum baby blues, but I did see in my research that Elizabeth also struggled with self-harm. And apparently as time went on, she got involved with some more self-destructive behaviors, which we will get into more in a little bit. So the once happy couple went from sharing a bed, cuddling each other every single night before falling asleep, to separate sleeping arrangements in their 3-story townhouse, being separate lives, sleeping separately, you name it. They were essentially living 2 completely different lives, but under the same roof. Elizabeth hadn't been seen or heard from now in over 24 hours, so you would think that it was her husband calling in, worried sick, wondering where she was, right? No, it wasn't Matt who called in. If you noticed earlier, I mentioned that the person who was calling 911 and filing the report was doing it on behalf of their best friend. So yeah, it wasn't even her own husband who filed her as a missing person. The friend who called and filed the report was a man named Nathan Character. Apparently, Nathan and Elizabeth had known each other for around 2 years, and they were best friends. They hung out all the time. They were constantly calling and texting each other. So when Elizabeth failed to respond to his calls and his text messages on the 13th, he began to get a little bit panicked. Now, Elizabeth was obviously an adult. She was juggling 2 kids under 4, so obviously she was a pretty busy woman, and Nathan knew that. He typically wasn't one to get all bent out of shape about a friend taking a little while to respond. So it was more so the circumstances and the timing that made him worry about Elizabeth, not necessarily about her not reaching back out. See, Nathan told the investigators that the reason that he was texting her on the 13th going into the 14th was because he knew that she was scheduled to meet with a divorce lawyer on the 13th. And like any good friend, he wanted to know how it went, see how he could support her. Obviously, those text messages and calls went unanswered, which then freaked him out. Now, in most cases where a wife goes missing, it's common sense to look into the husband first and foremost, right? Even more so when there are layers to it, such as a bad marriage and the fact that Matt, her husband, wasn't the one to report her as a missing person. Now there was the added information about Elizabeth seemingly looking into her options for a divorce. Didn't look good. It's pretty hard to take all of those things, then combine those with a missing person and not have it seem suspicious. But just because something looks suspicious doesn't necessarily mean it is 100%. So as annoying as it is to hear, they ended up questioning whether Elizabeth left on her own accord or not. I know not many people just up and leave, but there are some rare cases where it does happen, especially if they are struggling, especially if there's some baby blues. So the possibility of Elizabeth being somebody who just picked up and left wasn't necessarily ruled out, but the investigators did believe that it was highly unlikely. Because when Elizabeth was first reported as missing, her car was still parked at her townhouse that she shared with her husband, Matt. Not that it would have been impossible to take off using other means of transportation, but it was highly unlikely. Plus, there were no signs that she had packed a bag or anything like that. She had just seemingly vanished into thin air. Now, speaking of their house, Matt told the detectives that they were more than welcome to come and look through the house after Elizabeth was first reported as missing. And after a quick run-through, the detectives concluded that nothing looked suspicious or out of place or out of the ordinary. And it's important to note that they didn't even have a search warrant or anything like that, so it wasn't like they were doing this in-depth search of the house with multiple detectives searching high and low through the entire house for days on end, running multiple tests, nothing like that. It was just one detective that went room to room. basically looking for anything that stood out right away. Think maybe a giant bloodstain on the floor, or Elizabeth's clothes in her closet thrown all over the ground with a missing suitcase. Big, obvious things like that. But none of that was there. It looked like any other normal lived-in house on a day-to-day basis with 2 kids under 4 years old. Now, the annoying thing about this case is that there really weren't any signs of Elizabeth leaving on her own, but there also weren't any signs of foul play. It was incredibly frustrating for the investigators and for Elizabeth's family. Well, some of her family, I should say that is. The day that Elizabeth was reported as missing, her dad, Edward Ricks, wasted absolutely no time at all flying to San Diego. He wanted to get involved with the ongoing search. Edward was adamant that there was no chance in hell that Elizabeth would just up and leave on her own. Yeah, she and Matt weren't doing well, but it wasn't just them. He swore up and down that she would never, ever leave her babies behind. And that's what all the families in all of these cases say, right? But to be fair, I mean, they're almost always right. Edward even told the police that he had this gut feeling he couldn't ignore, that something bad had happened to his daughter. Something bad had happened to Elizabeth. He also told the investigators that the last time that he spoke to Elizabeth, on the 13th, she literally told him that she was going to lock herself in her bedroom that night, presumably to get as far away from Matt as possible. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence that she was supposed to meet with a divorce lawyer, and she was talking about locking herself in her room, all the same day that she went missing, right? I mean, I know coincidences don't solve cases, but sometimes these red flags are like sticking out like a sore thumb, and they can lead investigators down a path to finding very viable clues and evidence. But as concerned as her dad was, Matt seemed like the polar opposite when it came to talking to the detectives. It was like every single answer he gave the investigators, it was always combined with some information that didn't make Elizabeth look like she was in the best light. It made her a little bit questionable. Almost like he was purposefully trying to throw shade or make her look bad. For example, when he was asked why he wasn't the one to report Elizabeth as missing, he said it was because it wasn't uncommon for this sort of thing to happen. He claimed that on one occasion, Elizabeth had actually spent the night in a local park because they had gotten into an argument, and that she pretty much just didn't want to be anywhere near him. He literally told the investigators that when he hadn't heard or seen from her on the 13th or 14th, he wasn't even concerned, and that he ultimately just decided to give her space, wherever she was, whatever she was doing. And that wasn't the only thing that Matt came forward with and told the investigators. And here's where we're getting into some of those self-destructive behaviors that I mentioned earlier. According to Matt, Elizabeth was dabbling in behaviors that she never was into before. She was going out way more often, she was partying with her friends all the time, and apparently she was even getting into some pretty hard drugs. So as much as it sounded like all of that information could very easily have been coming from this resentful, angry partner, some of it ended up being confirmed by Elizabeth's best friend, Nathan. He admitted to the investigators that they were dabbling in drugs. And I'm not just talking about smoking a joint here or there, something like that, because literally the weekend before Elizabeth had gone missing, they both took crystal meth 2 different times. Nathan also confirmed that, yeah, like Matt said, they had been going out, they had been drinking a lot, they had been partying a lot. None of that made Elizabeth's disappearance look the greatest in the grand scheme of things, and in the wrong hands, this case could very easily have been dismissed as a runaway situation, and then never looked into again. But luckily, the investigation did continue. There was just something fishy about Matt, and he didn't make matters any better by how hard he seemed to be pushing this narrative of Elizabeth essentially being a bad mom, a bad wife who just left him, left their 2 kids behind. The investigators had learned a lot about Matt and Elizabeth's crumbling marriage, but it was all pretty much on a superficial level. They knew it wasn't going great, but they wanted to do a deep dive into it. They wanted to figure out what the common cause of all of the arguments were and what the family dynamic was like, because they had no motive. And as it turns out, Elizabeth, she had some in-laws from hell, and this was a huge point of contention in their marriage. They never really got along. I couldn't find the specific reasons, but apparently it was bad enough that Elizabeth was working on getting a restraining order against them. Also, they couldn't be in the couple's townhome. So I would say things have had to have gotten pretty bad for it to get to that point. It wasn't just the in-law situation that made things so rocky, though. The investigators found out that there were plenty of allegations made by Elizabeth against Matt. Just a few months before her disappearance in March of 2014, Elizabeth actually called 911 herself, and she raised some pretty concerning alarms, especially now in hindsight. She told the operator that there was a long history of violence in her marriage with Matt, and that on that day specifically, the two of them were in a very heated argument over custody and child support. She even reported that she was afraid that these arguments would escalate. Apparently, when the police came to the house, Matt blew it all off, though, and told them that Elizabeth had been draining their shared bank account, that it was all her, and Matt was never charged, he was never arrested, not only on that day, but ever. So I'm assuming that the call wasn't taken very seriously. Elizabeth's friends were also coming forward to the investigators, and they were vouching that they had seen and experienced Elizabeth being scared or even physically hurt by Matt. Remember Elizabeth's best friend, Calandra? She claimed that literally just days before Elizabeth disappeared, she FaceTimed her, and she was a witness to Matt getting very, very aggressive. It was pretty clear in the call that the two of them were arguing, and Calandra claimed that she heard Matt yell something at Elizabeth before then throwing a burrito that he was eating in her direction, which ultimately hit her in the back of the head. Calandra wasn't the only friend who had something to say about Elizabeth's fears and worries when it came to Matt either. Literally during the 911 call when Nathan reported her missing, he specifically told the police that Elizabeth feared her husband. Nathan also claimed that Elizabeth had confided in him on more than one occasion, saying that what she and Matt had was a loveless marriage, and that she apparently knew and understood that she married Matt for what she allegedly called all the wrong reasons. Now, all of this might sound like a lot to take in, but we're not even finished with all of the things that started to come out after Elizabeth's disappearance. Things that just made Matt look sketchier and sketchier. Everything might already point to Matt having a motive, but this next bit of information that the investigators found made everything seem like a full no-brainer. Because a month before Elizabeth went missing, Matt discovered that she had been unfaithful in their marriage. It sounds like, by all accounts, they were actually separated by this point, talking about child support, who would get custody, so on, but they still were legally married. And when Matt learned about the things that Elizabeth was doing outside of the house, he was pissed. Apparently, Elizabeth had made some online dating accounts, and she was getting back into the dating scene secretly on the down low. She actually ended up meeting a guy, and they had pretty decent chemistry. The only downfall was that Elizabeth wasn't being entirely open and honest on her dating account. She failed to mention that she was still legally married. So then one day, when she was going out on a date with this new guy, he got concerned when he saw 2 empty car seats in the backseat of her car. Now, we obviously know it's probably very likely that the girls were at home with Matt at the time, but Elizabeth's date didn't even know that Matt existed. So he was worried that maybe Elizabeth was being neglectful and leaving her young kids home alone just to go on a date. So he ended up getting CPS involved. And to be 100% clear, Elizabeth wasn't actually leaving her kids at home or being neglectful, but like I said, this guy didn't know that. He was just trying to do the right thing, make sure that they were safe. So CPS showed up, knocking on the door to Elizabeth and Matt's townhome. And because of that, Elizabeth's new man, her online dating accounts, all of it was brought to Matt's attention. So in the month before her disappearance, tensions were apparently really, really high. And Elizabeth was just checked out. She was over it. And that's why she was meeting with divorce lawyers to go over her options. On top of all of that, in the early stages of the investigation, Matt went out of his way to continue pushing this narrative of Elizabeth leaving willingly. It's one thing to open up in a police interview, but Matt straight up called 911, and he was like, "Hey, I have even more proof that she left me willingly." Apparently his 911 call was to just let the police know that he had gotten a notification that money had been withdrawn from their shared account, but he sounded extremely frustrated. And he claimed that Elizabeth was purposefully trying to frame him and get him arrested, instead of just reporting to the police that she had gone willingly.
And she said that she took all the money out of your shared bank account?
Maybe 15 cents left. I'm still here with my children, and I don't know what she's doing.
Now this sounds like this would have been a huge break in the case, right? But the investigators were never able to prove that Elizabeth was the one who had withdrawn the money. And without proof, it very easily could have been Matt who made that withdrawal. As much as Matt seemed like he wasn't too concerned and was more angry at Elizabeth than anything else, he completely changed his tune when it came to talking to the media. I don't know if he realized that he was looking bad or that he was the only person of interest in the case at the time, but he seemed to be doing some serious damage control. In an interview with People magazine about a month after Elizabeth was reported as missing, he seemed like the most loving, caring, and worried, grief-stricken husband that a girl could have asked for. He went on and on about how he was constantly searching for Elizabeth, how he just wanted her back home, all of the negative effects that her disappearance has had on him. But even in his interview, he somehow managed to throw in some wording that made it sound like Elizabeth had left on her own. Because he said, "I'm at the end of my rope. I'm running on fumes right now. I don't know where to look. I'm always looking around the neighborhood, trying to catch a glimpse of her. Even if I got a phone call saying she's okay, it would put my mind at rest." But nothing at this point. Matt also made most of the interview about himself, saying that Elizabeth's disappearance has taken a toll on him both mentally and physically, all the way to the point of losing 25 pounds. No mention of begging whoever had Elizabeth to bring her back home or asking the public to help if anybody knew information about what happened to her, if they'd seen anything. He seemed pretty convinced that she was just gone, living a new life somewhere out there, not unable but simply unwilling to call and just put everybody's mind at ease. Case closed, that's what it is, that's what he thinks. Elizabeth's dad also did an interview, but his and Matt's interviews were basically night and day. Her dad never fully said his theory on what he thought happened to Elizabeth, but it's pretty easy to gather from what he said that he believes that foul play was involved in some type of way. He told the media, "I feel like she's in trouble, and I've come out here from Virginia to look for her and to let her know that we're here. I have hope, I have faith, I walk by faith. If in any way she hears this and can get to a telephone or in some way reach out to me, we will come and get her. That's what I want her to know." So it sounds to me like maybe he believed that she was possibly being held captive against her will. I'm not sure if her dad knew about her recent drug usage, but it does make me wonder if he somehow thought that might be involved in some way, especially based by the words in his interview. Either way, it's clear to me at least that Matt and Edward were on the complete opposite sides of the spectrum when it came to where Elizabeth could be, or how she ended up in whatever situation she was in. Meanwhile, her family was doing everything that they possibly could do to bring Elizabeth home. They raised as much awareness of her case as possible. They were hanging up missing persons flyers all around town. They were begging the public to keep an eye out. They even started a GoFundMe account to raise money for a private investigator. And getting the public involved in these cases can be sometimes a real gamble, because sometimes people come forward with information that is super helpful to the case, information that they didn't even realize would be helpful, but then other times it can just lead to false hope, to dead ends. And sadly, it was the latter of the two in Elizabeth's case. Someone came forward to the police department claiming that they saw Elizabeth on October 19th, which was less than a week after she was reported as missing, and the report claimed that she was at a soccer field in Liberty Station, which is in the area of San Diego that she lived in. They said that they saw her there at around 11:30 a.m. So if this sighting was accurate, that means that she would have been pretty close to home. She was allegedly wearing what was described by the San Diego Police Department as black stretch pants, so probably yoga pants or some type of leggings, and also pairing that with a gray sweatshirt. So this sighting gave her family a lot of hope, but it also made it seem like Matt's theory of her just running off could be somewhat plausible. It's important to note that the investigators were in no way able to confirm or deny the sighting, though. Plus, the sighting came from someone who didn't even know Elizabeth personally. They had just seen some of the pictures that were posted online, that were posted around town, and they thought that whoever they saw at that soccer field looked similar to her. The sighting left the investigators kind of right where they were before, in an annoying middle ground. It was a 50-50 chance that it could have been her. Unfortunately, the search for Elizabeth never got any easier or less frustrating. When I say it seemed like she vanished into thin air, I truly mean it. Clearly, nobody just vanishes into thin air, but from the lack of any evidence to point in either direction, the investigators pretty much were still at ground zero. They had nothing to go off of. The lead detective in the case actually described the lack of any tips other than that one insignificant sighting as being ominous. And I get that. There was absolutely nothing. And that made everything all the more weird, all the more freaky, all the more concerning. Then, after 10 long, grueling months of searching for Elizabeth, her case went from being a major headline and news story to a cold case. Her disappearance was an absolute mystery that stumped everyone from seasoned detectives to online super sleuths. Nobody could figure it out. She was just gone. Another unsolved mystery in a very long list of unsolved cases. For 2 whole years, there was no news surrounding Elizabeth's disappearance. And I'm sure there might have been some continuous behind-the-scenes work from the investigators, but it's not like there were constant updates on the case. But then, in 2016, there was a massive break in the case that nobody was expecting, and it ignited the entire investigation to just start booming all over again. On October 6th, 2016, just days before the second anniversary of Elizabeth's disappearance, a call came in to 911. This call was a report of a dead body floating in the San Diego Bay. Now, interestingly, it was only half a mile from Elizabeth's home. When this call came in, a lot of people were holding their breaths. Could this be Elizabeth? And less than a mile away from the last place that she had known to have been seen? Authorities couldn't get their hopes up too much before a positive ID from a coroner. I mean, just because the body was found a half a mile away from Elizabeth's last known location, it didn't necessarily mean that it was her. San Diego is a huge place, and it had almost been 2 full years since her disappearance. So when the investigators arrived on the scene, one of the first things that they noted was that the body was pretty badly decomposed. They weren't just going to be able to take a quick look and identify if it was or wasn't Elizabeth. The first responders all said that they felt the exact same way. I mean, something in their gut was telling them that it was Elizabeth. The body being found so close to her home and basically on her 2-year anniversary, it just seemed like it couldn't be a coincidence. And as if those two things aren't crazy enough on their own, the investigators made yet another coincidental discovery. Whether it was protocol or just out of respect, the investigators dropped by Matt and Elizabeth's house to inform Matt that a body had been found and that they were currently working on identifying it so that they could rule it out as Elizabeth. And when they stopped by and Matt opened the door, they were greeted with boxes and boxes. They were labeled with furniture, kitchen supplies, I mean, all of it. So Matt was packing his bags and he was moving. He told them that he actually left the Navy altogether and that he and his, get this, new pregnant fiancée and his 2 daughters were moving to Delaware. It seemed like Matt had definitely moved on, right? The investigators even learned that his new girlfriend moved in with him just 2 months after Elizabeth's disappearance. So for someone who was doing interviews claiming that he was so depressed, he was at the end of his rope, I mean, he managed to make time to get into another relationship, one that was serious enough for the 2 of them to move in with each other, all while Elizabeth's case was still hot, ongoing, brand new, fresh. Unfortunately, the body that was recovered in the bay was so badly decomposed that it took a little over 2 months to identify. But when the results finally came in from the dental records, nobody was surprised to hear that the body was in fact Elizabeth's. Her case was reopened, and it was now being investigated as a homicide. At the time that the body was confirmed to be hers, the detectives weren't releasing much information. All they said was that she was believed to have been murdered, and that now her case was a homicide case. And it turns out her death was pretty gruesome. She had been severely beaten and also stabbed to death. Her autopsy showed that she had at least 5 stab wounds to her chest, and they were so deep that they hit her ribs. They even broke a few of her ribs. Her jaw and her nose were also broken. Now, maybe one of the most important things that the detectives were able to gather from recovering Elizabeth's body was the fact that even though it was badly decomposed, it didn't look like the body was in the water for a very long period of time. Definitely not for 2 years. So that means that whoever murdered Elizabeth very likely recently dumped her body in that bay, hoping that it would never be found or recovered. And they also were hoping that their tracks would be covered. Not to mention the autopsy report noted that it seemed like her body had been laying on one side for a significant amount of time. Now, I'm not sure what it is exactly that would indicate something like that, but at the very least, it seemed like they were trying to say that her body had more than likely been kept elsewhere, untouched, just laying on the same side until it was then transported into the bay. Matt had always been a person of interest in Elizabeth's case. I mean, there was no denying it. And I don't want to say that after they found her body, they weren't looking into anybody else, but he was the only person who they could find that would have any sort of motive to kill Elizabeth, not to mention the insanely coincidental timing of everything that was happening. The only other person that investigators even gave the time of day to was the boyfriend of Elizabeth's, who had called CPS on her, because Matt, shockingly, had cooperated with the investigation more than that guy had even. Apparently, when he was asked to take a polygraph test, he lawyered up, which didn't make him look great. But for whatever reason, he ended up being ruled out, and it was all back to Matt, and Matt alone. Now, just to clarify and give a better understanding of how insane everything was lining up against Matt, we now have Elizabeth's body, found almost 2 years exactly from when she first disappeared, just blocks away from the last place that she was seen, found on the exact day that Matt, aka the only person of interest in her case, was packing up his house, packing up his bags, and moving across the country, or maybe fleeing across the country. I mean, really, what are the odds? And the difficult part of this case was finding evidence that would be justifiable to use against Matt and to prove that he was the one who murdered Elizabeth. Coincidence alone was definitely not going to put him behind bars. Now remember, when Elizabeth first went missing, the investigators did a quick run-through of the townhome, and they didn't see anything that really stuck out as being odd. But remember, it wasn't an in-depth or thorough search to really say with 100% confidence that no crime had gone down at that house. But the house would become a key player in solving what happened to Elizabeth. Just throwing around theories, the investigators started to wonder if Matt could have possibly murdered Elizabeth at their house and then kept her body hidden somewhere in the home for 2 whole years. I mean, the fact that her body had been tossed in the bay the exact same day that Matt was moving out, what other reason would you need to finally get rid of the body that you've been hiding successfully for 2 years straight? It seemed like that could be a pretty reasonable theory. It's not like if Elizabeth was being kept somewhere in the house, Matt could risk leaving her behind and simply hope that whatever new owners come in didn't stumble across her remains. And the police were already in the process of getting a warrant to search the townhome, search it more thoroughly, and that's when they learned something new. Back on the exact same day that Elizabeth was reported as missing, Matt apparently went to Home Depot and he bought a high-pressure carpet cleaner. Now let's face it, guys, no innocent person buys a carpet cleaner on the same day that their estranged wife is reported as missing, so the police knew that they needed to get a move on things, and fast. The investigators were curious what Matt's reasoning for buying a carpet cleaner would have been, so they went directly to the source and they asked him. And like all suspicious people, he had the perfect answer lined up, ready to go for whenever the day came, and whenever the authorities started asking these questions. Remember earlier how we talked about Elizabeth's mental health? We mentioned that she had been known in the past to possibly have some struggles with self-infliction, ideations, and things like that. Well, you best believe that good old Matt was going to use her own demons against her. He told the detectives that the reason that he needed that carpet cleaner was because she had harmed herself not long before her disappearance. And to really make the story sink in, he even told them about a time when Elizabeth had allegedly broken a mirror in their bedroom and used the shards of glass to cut herself. Not that they believed him or this story, but hey, I guess at least he tried. So finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigators were given the okay on the search warrant request for Matt and Elizabeth's old townhome. And this search was literally like they hit the jackpot. After so many months of working tirelessly in their searches just to come up empty, it was like they were being rewarded with evidence tenfold. The 2 biggest pieces of evidence were found in the master bedroom of the house and in the attic. And first, we'll start with what they found in the master bedroom. Remember, Matt bought that heavy-duty carpet cleaner the day that Elizabeth was reported as missing, and it seemed to have served its purpose very well, but not well enough. Just looking at the carpet, it looked completely fine. No stains, no discoloration, nothing. But as you know, there's only so much that a carpet cleaner can hide, because on the underside of the carpet there was a giant dark stain that looked to be a blood stain. Underneath the carpeting was wood flooring too, and the stain didn't just stop at the carpet. It completely soaked into the wood and it stained the wood as well. The DNA was taken in for testing, and it was later determined that the stain on the floor was in fact a blood stain. And, no shocker, the blood belonged to Elizabeth. Now, since there had been enough blood to soak into both the carpet and the wood, the investigators were finally able to identify a crime scene area. That evidence was huge, but nothing could have been as damning as what they found in the attic. Inside of the attic, hidden in the walls, was a knife, and just like the floor in the bedroom, the knife also had what looked to be bloodstains on it. The knife was taken in for testing, and sure enough, the blood was found to be Elizabeth's. They had officially now found the murder weapon. So now we have the body, the crime scene, and the murder weapon. But one huge thing was still unanswered. Where had Elizabeth's body been for those whole 2 years before it was dumped in the bay? I mean, the murder weapon wasn't very cleverly hidden. So what if it had been the same for Elizabeth's body? Could Matt have hidden her decomposing body inside that house? The main thing that made the investigators really question whether or not that was possible was the fact that her body would have definitely released a smell. They lived in a townhome, literally connected to people on either side. It wasn't like they lived in a little country home on acres of land in the middle of nowhere. If he had just shoved her decomposing body into the attic, especially in the California heat, surely somebody would have noticed. When the investigators brought in the cadaver dogs, they were led right to the possible answer of where her body could have been all of those 2 years. The dogs didn't head up the stairs to the bedroom or to the attic, but they immediately went to the garage. And inside the garage was one huge, very decently sized freezer. So yeah, I think you know where this is going. The dogs made a beeline to the freezer, no second guessing, and they indicated that they found a hit. Now, as a side note, remember that by the time they're doing this search, Matt doesn't live there anymore, meaning he left this freezer behind in the move, which it literally makes me want to gag. Imagine a family moving into that house and storing their extra bags of like chicken nuggets for their kids, whatever it may be, in the same freezer that a dead body more than likely sat for years. Now, this whole thing would become pretty controversial because the cadaver dogs indicated that they believed that Elizabeth had been kept in the freezer, and it made perfect sense. Her body was decomposing, but not as much as you would expect for somebody who had been dead that long, and she definitely hadn't been in the water the whole time. There was also the fact that her autopsy mentioned that it looked like her body had been laid on one side for a long period of time, which too would make sense if she was just laying in the freezer, unmoved, for months on end. But the controversial thing is that there wasn't really any evidence to prove it 100%. It added up and it made perfect sense, but it's not like there were bloodstains or anything that could really verify or disprove it, which is something I will bring up later. But thank God for that search warrant, because they finally had enough evidence to move forward with arresting Matt and pressing charges against him. It's like they knew all along that he did something to Elizabeth, but literally could not find a single thing to prove it until they searched the house. So on January 31st, 2018, Matt was finally arrested at his new home in Delaware, and he was charged with first-degree murder. Now, as much as it might seem to us hearing this story that Matt's arrest was a no-brainer, the whole thing took the media by surprise, and Elizabeth's case was now once again headlining news. At the time, it's not like the investigators were divulging to the media every single detail in this case, because when Elizabeth's body was first found, her cause of death hadn't even been released to the public at all. The search of the house was also kept pretty low-key. And although it was known that Matt was the only person of interest, none of the information about their marriage, the turmoil behind the scenes, none of that had gotten out yet. So as far as the media was concerned, he was just an average, concerned husband moving on with his life after his wife had left him. It wasn't until after his arrest that the media learned that Elizabeth was meeting with a divorce lawyer on the day that she was last seen. And it's like after Matt was arrested, everything started getting leaked, and it was all making sense. Everybody was starting to see the puzzle pieces come together. On Valentine's Day 2018, he ended up being arraigned in Elizabeth's murder. And that's not really a huge piece of information that's key for anybody remembering, but I did think that it was interesting. And it kind of just makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside, knowing that this piece of crap, this wife murderer, was arraigned on the biggest holiday dedicated to love. The universe, God, whatever you believe in, it never fails to just throw in some of that lovely irony or karma right when you least expect it. Now, to nobody's surprise, Matt pleaded not guilty and proclaimed his innocence as much as he had the same day that Elizabeth went missing. Matt's trial began on February 21st, 2020, and thankfully it only lasted about a month. And it was right before COVID happened, so who knows how long it would have been pushed back. As soon as the trial started, prosecutors went right into exactly why Matt would have had the motive. They also went into the evidence that was found in the home. A lot of what was focused on are things that we already went through and mentioned, so I'm not going to go too in-depth and get repetitive, but they talked heavily about Elizabeth's affair, how Matt discovered it the month before her disappearance. The district attorney on the case also argued that her affair was more than enough motive for Matt to murder her. Not to mention, the crime scene being in their bedroom and the murder weapon being in the attic. Come on. But I get it. Innocent until proven guilty, all of that. Now, Matt's defense team's argument during his trial is really what we're going to focus on here. Because remember, Matt had pretty much been setting up this alibi the entire time that Elizabeth had been thinking of self-harming multiple times. She had left on her own, and he even accused her during that 911 call of purposefully framing him. So his defense team painted Elizabeth not as this loving, doting mother that everybody knew her to be, but they described her as somebody who was abusing drugs, who was abusing alcohol heavily, which again, her friend did admit that they had dabbled in it, but it was hardly relevant to her brutal murder.
What started out as a glass of wine became bottles of whiskey. What started out as marijuana became cocaine. What started out as amphetamine abuse turned into methamphetamine.
But it gave Matt's defense team something to work off of and kind of point to. Like, hey, what we're saying isn't just coming out of nowhere. Matt's been saying this stuff all along. His defense team also argued that the carpet cleaner had nothing to do with cleaning up a crime scene. The blood had come from one of those times that Elizabeth was self-harming. And Matt was just trying to be helpful, trying to love her. He was being the loving husband, cleaning up her mess so that she wouldn't have to. They also refused to call it a bloodstain in court. I'm sure because they realized that it made it sound pretty bad. So instead, they just referred to it as suspicious flooding, which suspicious flooding is what you call a water leak in your house when you aren't sure where it's coming from, not proven bloodstains. Now, this next thing wasn't mentioned in court. It was just something that I thought of, but I never saw anywhere that Elizabeth had ever been hospitalized from her self-harming, from anything like that. Which isn't to say that when she did do it, it wasn't bad, because I'm sure it was, but I would think that if there was enough blood to completely soak through the carpet and into the wood, then she would have likely been severely injured, like enough to need immediate medical attention. Again, that's just something that came to my mind. It wasn't like it was like a paper cut amount of blood, but anyway, moving on. So Matt's defense team also had the perfect explanation for the murder weapon and for Elizabeth's blood being on it. And I'm curious if you guys can guess where they're going to go with this, because again, they tried to pin all of the blame on Elizabeth. They argued that apparently this knife was the knife that Elizabeth had used to hurt herself, which is why her blood was of course on it. They argued that she had probably just hid it there herself, either to keep it a secret from Matt, or, once again, in an attempt to frame him. It's just so odd to me that they kept going for this angle of Elizabeth still trying to frame him, because her body was found so severely beaten and stabbed. I mean, give me a break. Did they think that some random person just did that to her and then she got lucky by framing Matt? Or that she seriously stabbed herself in the chest 5 times and somehow managed to dump her own body in the bay? Their argument was not logical at all. Like, it was not making sense. Now, I mentioned earlier about the freezer in the garage and how it turned out to be pretty controversial. This was another thing that Matt's defense team really focused on, and they argued that it couldn't be proven. The prosecution argued that Matt stabbed Elizabeth to death, then kept her in the freezer, then dumped her body when he realized that he was moving. But like I said, the freezer was empty, and the only thing that led them to believe that she could have been there at all was the cadaver dogs picking up on her smell. And also the fact that it made sense, which really isn't evidence though in the grand scheme of things. That was pretty much the one and only thing that his defense team made a valid argument against. So after wrapping up 10 days of trial, the jury deliberated for a day and a half. But then they came back with a verdict. Matt was found guilty. But instead of first-degree murder, he was found guilty of second-degree murder. Matt was sentenced to 16 years to life, and I wish I could say that he showed any remorse whatsoever or begged Elizabeth's family for forgiveness, but all he did was complain about how his trial wasn't fair. And after the verdict was read, Matt actually had the balls to stand up in front of everyone and make a statement. He told the courtroom, "The only issue I had about the trial was I believe I was not allowed to call in relevant witnesses to my defense. I thoroughly believe their testimony would have thoroughly changed the verdict in this trial." Do you really think that their so-called witness testimony would have changed the verdict, Matt? Or did you really mean to say that you think that their testimony could have fooled the jury? And really, you're just mad that you have to sit in prison for the rest of your life wondering, what if? Elizabeth's family spoke at the sentencing and said that they were happy that justice was being served. But, of course, it will never take away from the pain and the agony of what really happened to Elizabeth. And as if Matt's statement didn't already show just how much of a crap he did not give, his face during her family's statements told all of it. He was emotionless and straight-faced the entire time.
No longer sentence won't make the pain go away, nor will my recanting of the sorrow I've gone through these last 6.5 years make this man feel any differently than he does now.
Matt has caused a tremendous amount of pain to me, Liz's family, and friends. There are no words to describe this pain that still sits in the pit of my heart.
She should have had decades to grow old and to watch her children grow up. And the defendant took all that away from her and from them.
I pray that Matt never see or experience freedom again.
It breaks my heart to think about Elizabeth's kids never getting the chance to grow up with a mom who just truly loved them unconditionally and supported them. Not to mention, because of Matt's horrible actions, they're now growing up without their mom or their dad. Luckily, Elizabeth's babies, who are now full-blown teenagers, are living with her parents, and I don't think that she would have wanted it any other way. The love and care that once surrounded her is now wrapping its arms around her daughters. And in a case like this one, I don't think that there could be a more appropriate ending other than that. So thank you for hearing Elizabeth's story today and keeping her voice alive. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of 10 to Life, and until the next one, stay safe. Bye.